The smell of rotting flesh was so overwhelming that seasoned courtiers vomited in the royal presence. Dogs licked at the fluids leaking from King Henry VIII's coffin. This is not the majestic end history often paints for England's most formidable ruler. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the shocking medical evidence that proves Henry VIII's transformation from golden prince to 400-pound monster, evidence that Tudor historians tried to hide for centuries. This comes from newly analysed court physician records and forensic examination of contemporary accounts. But let me back up and show you exactly how England's most powerful king became this grotesque shell of humanity, because what you're about to learn changes everything historians have told you about the Tudor dynasty. The man who executed 2 wives and reshaped an entire nation's religion died in a way so horrifying, so undignified, that his own government covered it up for centuries. However, secret medical records have finally revealed the truth, and it starts with a jousting accident that would slowly rot him from the inside out. Picture this: January 24th, 1536, Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, still relatively fit and vigorous at 44, charges down the tilt-yard on his massive destrier, a warhorse bred for the shock of combat. The crowd holds its breath as England's king, a vision of Renaissance power, aims his lance at his opponent. The afternoon sun glints off his specially crafted armour, gilded and etched, each piece alone worth more than a common labourer would earn in a lifetime. The ground trembles under the thunder of hooves as 2 armoured titans race toward each other at breakneck speed. This was more than sport. It was a carefully choreographed theatre of power, designed to showcase the king's strength, agility, and divine right to rule. But something went catastrophically wrong. The horses collided with the force of a modern car crash. Henry's armoured body, all 300 pounds of man and metal, crashed to the frozen ground. The crowd gasped in horror as they watched his horse, wearing its own suit of armour, stumble and fall. The beast fell directly on top of the king. The tilt-yard went silent. Courtiers froze in place, too terrified to move. Was the king dead? Had England just lost its monarch to a sport? For 2 hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. 2 hours where England had no king. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, pregnant with what she desperately hoped would be a male heir, waited in agony for news. 2 hours that would change everything. When Henry finally woke up, witnesses reported something deeply disturbing. The king's eyes, once bright with intelligence and charm, eyes that had charmed Catherine of Aragon and captivated Anne Boleyn, now held a different light, something darker, more unpredictable. His first words weren't relief at survival or concern for his subjects' worry. Instead, he flew into a rage, demanding to know why the tournament had been stopped. The charming Renaissance prince who could speak 4 languages, who wrote poetry and composed music, who danced until dawn and debated theology with Europe's finest minds, that man never fully returned from the tilt-yard that day. In his place emerged a paranoid tyrant with violent mood swings that would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists studying the historical records now believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the area controlling personality, impulse control, and executive function. The evidence is compelling and stark. Before the accident, Henry showed remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era. He'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment. He'd executed relatively few nobles compared to his predecessors. But after January 1536, the executions began in earnest. The temperamental shift was so severe and so sudden that it cannot be explained by mere aging or frustration. Anne Boleyn lost her head just 4 months later, accused of crimes that many historians now believe were fabrications born of the king's new paranoia. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted advisor, would eventually follow. The king's rages became legendary. Servants reported finding him weeping uncontrollably one moment, then screaming for blood the next, his emotions as volatile as gunpowder. But the brain injury was just the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. The same accident that scrambled his personality also reopened an old wound on his leg that would never heal again. And this is where our story turns from tragedy to body horror. Now, the thing most people don't realize is that Henry had suffered a previous leg injury years earlier, likely from another jousting incident, a constant occupational hazard. It had healed, leaving only a small, silvered scar. But the tremendous impact of the 1536 accident tore that old wound wide open, shattering the fragile tissue and likely driving fragments of filthy armour and padding deep into the muscle. In Tudor England, without antibiotics or any understanding of germ theory, an open wound was a ticking time bomb, a death sentence, just a very slow and agonising one. Imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days or weeks but for 11 long years, constantly weeping pus, never fully scabbing over. The pain so intense that even the gentlest touch of silk bed sheets would make you scream. Court physician doctor. Thomas Vickery's secret notes, hidden in the Royal College of Physicians and only discovered in the 1962nd, describe ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that servants would quickly remove from the royal presence, gagging from the stench. But Henry, in his vanity and deepening paranoia, tried desperately to hide this deterioration. He designed special gutters with lead weights to compress the wounds, believing pressure would force them closed. Instead, this medieval thinking cut off circulation and made the infection worse, creating a perfect anaerobic environment for bacteria to thrive. He doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with ambergris to mask the ever-present stench of his own decaying flesh. He even instructed his portrait painters, like the brilliant Hans Holbein, to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous, the wide-legged power stance we all recognize, a complete and powerful fiction designed to project strength where there was only festering weakness. The infection wasn't just destroying his legs, it was systematically poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every day, a constant stream of toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, travelling to his brain, his liver, his heart. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in contemporary accounts suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that releases bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the body. This biological cascade of poison would have made Henry's life a living hell, transforming his magnificent body into a prison of unending agony. The constant throbbing pain would have been excruciating, a relentless fire in his limbs that never stopped for over a decade. The fever would come and go, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next, his body locked in a futile war against itself. His appetite would swing wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger, leading to a drastic physical transformation that would become its own kind of curse. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, the man was unrecognizable. Unable to exercise due to the debilitating leg pain and eating constantly to distract from his misery, he ballooned from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armour from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, shows a 48-inch waist. By 1545, new armour had to be commissioned with a 54-inch waist measurement. Let that sink in. 54 inches. That's larger than most modern refrigerators are wide. The very palaces that were monuments to his power had to be modified to accommodate the king's new bulk. Doorways at Hampton Court were widened. You can still see the construction marks today. Floors were reinforced with additional beams after the king's immense weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with arms that could be removed because Henry could no longer fit between them. His world was literally shrinking around him. But it wasn't just furniture that needed modification. The king's daily routine became an elaborate, humiliating performance designed to hide his deterioration. He would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 servants to manage his massive swollen limbs. A system of pulleys and slings was installed to lift him upright, a mechanical contraption hoisting the defender of the faith onto his feet. He would then be transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from public view, a state secret more closely guarded than some matters of diplomacy. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental deterioration, fueled by the toxins crossing into his brain tissue. These toxins caused mood swings that had nothing to do with his actual emotions. One moment he might be laughing at a jest, the next ordering the jester's execution for a perceived slight. paranoid delusions became commonplace. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery behind every tapestry, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadowy corridor. By 1544, courtiers reported behaviour that went beyond mere bad temper into the realm of madness. Henry would hold entire conversations with people who weren't there. He was observed arguing with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. Most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of colour as he stared at empty air. He would whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me," before exploding in rage at his confused counsellors. One particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary heights. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters not just for his meals but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin first to test for poison. The court, in response, developed an intricate culture of terror and survival. Courtiers created an elaborate warning system. Pages would discreetly signal the king's disposition using coloured ribbons: red for rage, black for depression, white for the increasingly rare moments of calm. A servant who sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court, her family's lands confiscated. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering executions of people who were already dead, having forgotten he'd killed them years earlier. He was not just a king, he was a force of nature, an unpredictable storm of pain and fury that everyone around him desperately tried to weather. Here's something that will shock you about how he tried to hide his condition. Henry's final portrait, the famous Whitehall mural that became the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret. When the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration work, conservators discovered that the king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple cane, that was originally painted holding something else entirely, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement. Henry had become so obsessed with mortality and decay, the very processes consuming him alive, that he carried this memento mori everywhere. He would tap the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tick that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was rumoured to be that of a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist, Hans Holbein, had painted this disturbing detail accurately, but after Henry's death, his son Edward VI's Regency Council ordered it painted over. The new government couldn't bear the thought of the king being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he had become. They needed the myth of the powerful monarch, not the reality of the suffering man. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognisable as human, a monarch trapped in a nightmare of his own decaying flesh, waiting for an end that could only be grotesque. January 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII entered his final decline, and what happened next was so disturbing that his own government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the physicians had seen before. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, the unmistakable grim evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell had become a physical presence in the palace, a suffocating miasma of death. Servants fainted while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather, because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin had turned a sickly yellow from liver failure, the whites of his eyes matching, giving him an inhuman, jaundiced appearance. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely speak, his words coming out as wet, gurgling sounds that required his closest, most terrified servants to interpret. His breath smelled of rotting meat, a sign that the infection had spread to his digestive system, poisoning him from within. The king's massive weight, now well over 400 pounds, made caring for him a Herculean task. It took 6 strong men to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though by this point new sores had developed anyway, adding to the catalogue of rotting flesh. His legs had swollen to such an extent that the skin split in multiple places, weeping clear fluid that soaked through dozens of bandages daily. But here's the detail that haunts me about his suffering. On January 20th, Henry experienced what physicians now recognise as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down. His urine, when he could produce any, was dark brown and ripe with ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and causing agonizing pressure on his other organs. He was, quite literally, drowning in his own poisons. The king's mental state during these final days alternated between terrifying clarity and complete unhinged delirium. In his lucid moments, he knew he was dying. He would beg his physicians to save him, promising them wealth beyond imagining if they could cure him. When they failed to provide relief, he would rage at them, threatening torture and execution, though he lacked the strength to even hold a pen to sign the warrants. In his delirious periods, Henry revealed the true depths of his terror and guilt. He would cry out for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons he saw crawling up from beneath his bed. He would have conversations with his brother Arthur, who had died in 1502, apologising for taking his throne, and his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Most pathetically, he would call out for Catherine herself, asking her forgiveness, though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier. The mighty sovereign was reduced to a frightened child, haunted by the ghosts of everyone he had wronged. The court maintained an elaborate facade during these final days. Official proclamations continued to describe the king as recovering from a minor ailment. Ambassadors were told Henry was simply resting and would receive them soon. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Edward Seymour and the other members of the Privy Council were already planning for the succession, knowing the king had at most days to live. On January 27th, Henry suffered what modern physicians would recognise as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely. Drool pooled on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech, already difficult due to his swollen tongue, became completely incomprehensible. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for a sip of water. Yet even in this state, paralysed and rotting, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he attempted to scratch out death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades but had fallen from favour. The signature was an illegible scrawl, more inkblot than name, but Henry's servants, terrified even of the dying king, prepared to carry out the execution. Only Henry's death the next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that historians have tried to hide for centuries. Henry VIII didn't die peacefully in his sleep like official records claim. He died screaming. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the library of Lambeth Palace in 1983, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final hours. The Archbishop had been summoned to provide last rites, arriving at the palace near midnight on January 27th. What he found in the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men had to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself further. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between seizures, he would vomit black bile, a sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was beyond description. Cranmer wrote that he had to excuse himself twice to vomit. During brief moments of stillness, Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs. He begged them to forgive him. He promised to be a better father if they would just come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high and terrified as he screamed about flames and demanded that someone put out the fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 inches the morning on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to the death rattle, a wet gurgling sound as the lungs fill with fluid. Cranmer, following Protestant doctrine, asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. The archbishop took Henry's massive swollen hand in his own and asked him to squeeze if he died in the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once, weakly, then his grip went slack. At 2:07 a.m., January 28th, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the horror wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. Henry's corpse, already saturated with infection, began decomposing with shocking speed. The bacteria that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death. They accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body swelled even larger as bacteria produced gases inside the corpse. The smell, impossibly, grew worse. Servants stationed outside the death chamber could be heard retching. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death secret for 3 days. This wasn't just political manoeuvring. They needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating body. It was too large and too decomposed to display publicly, without causing a scandal that could shatter the mystique of monarchy. Embalmers were summoned urgently, but they faced an impossible task. When they opened Henry's body to remove the organs for preservation, they discovered the extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased it fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. One embalmer's assistant fainted when the stomach was opened, releasing such a concentrated stench that workers fled the room. They worked frantically for 2 days, using techniques that would be considered extreme even by Tudor standards. They packed the body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs. They wrapped the corpse in waxed cloth soaked in turpentine. They sealed everything in a massive lead coffin that required special reinforcement to hold the weight. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't contain Henry's decay. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside the sealed container. The lead began to bulge outward. Officials hurriedly draped more black cloth over the coffin to hide its distortion. Then came the funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th. Henry's coffin, weighing nearly half a ton with its reinforcements, required a specially built carriage pulled by 8 horses. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched to 3 as the horses struggled with the weight and the winter rains turned the roads to mud. On the second night, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey. Ironically, one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. What happened next was so grotesque that it passed into legend, though contemporary accounts confirm it actually occurred. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much. The lead coffin split open, with a sound witnesses described as like a thunderclap. Putrid fluids leaked out, pooling on the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that guards fled their posts. And then came the final, grotesque indignity. In the morning, workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night. They found the animals licking at the putrid fluids that had leaked from the king's coffin. The man who had styled himself as God's anointed on earth, who had broken from Rome itself to assert his divine right to rule, ended up as food for scavenging dogs. Palace workers used sawdust and lime to soak up the remains, working with cloths tied over their faces. The coffin was hastily resealed with fresh lead, though the damage to royal dignity was complete. When the procession finally reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly, without the elaborate ceremony originally planned. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered all witnesses to absolute silence on pain of death. The official record stated simply that Henry had died peacefully and been buried with all appropriate honours. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. So Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorised a nation, died rotting from the inside out, screaming in terror, his corpse so putrid it exploded in its coffin. The golden Renaissance prince, who had once been called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ended his life as a 400-pound mass of infection and decay, abandoned by his terrified courtiers, his final remains licked up by stray